struggles with anything, shut this door. Shoot us out. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Here we go. Okay. All right, so we looked at aerobic metabolism, right? So Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. And so now we're going to take a look at what's going on at any one time. Am I more likely to be using carbohydrate or fat? So which we're using, which substrate we're using, whether we're going with carbs or fat, depends partly on the availability. Right? So how much energy can be produced, how much of it is available, how hard am I working, how long am I working for. That means that in an acute scenario, when you've had a meal, the substrate that's going to be used will depend upon that meal. So if I have a meal that's really high in carbs, bless you, I'm more likely to use, bless you, good Lord. Okay, next one, going in threes. Then I'm more likely to use carbohydrate. If I have a meal that's high in fat, then there's a possibility I'm going to use more fat if I exercise after that meal. Also, on a chronic scenario, we see some adaptation if we use a high-fat or a high-protein diet to metabolizing those a little bit more than we would do typically. All right. Remember, if we're using protein, that's minimal. All right. So less than 60 minutes, less than an hour's worth of exercise, very little amount of protein, and even in a marathon type length of exercise, we're not going to use a lot, on average around 10%. Okay. And anaerobic pathways are only going to use stored ATP, stored phosphocreatine, or stored glucose, glycogen. And if we're working aerobically, then we're going to use carbohydrate and fats. That means then that if I want to lose weight, I can't do that by working out at a very high intensity. Okay? I have to be working out in the right range to utilize stored triglycerides. So we'll have a look at what does that mean today. Right? So our first idea is then, how hard am I working? Right? What intensity am I working at? So hopefully you've been doing some looking. Every time that word comes up, you've been paying attention, because you should be including some discussion about intensity in your physical activity log. Right? So, am I going to use fat, or am I going to use carbohydrate? Am I going to use glucose or glycogen? So, when you're sitting here, when you're resting, when you're asleep, about a third of your ATP comes from carbohydrate and 2/3 from fat stores. The higher the intensity, the harder I work, the more carbohydrate is used. Right? Theoretically then, at maximal intensity, at 100% intensity, 100% carbs would be being used as an anaerobic source, except we don't ever really work at 100% intensity. Can't, you'd be on your face. Okay? So some of the factors that play a role in using carbohydrate as we work harder. Carbohydrate is smaller, so I can get at it faster. We talked about that on Wednesday and in lab yesterday. It produces more energy per litre of oxygen. So if I'm working aerobically, I can make more ATP with a little less oxygen use because it's a smaller molecule. Right? In maybe chapter 4 or 5, can't remember which one, we're going to start looking at skeletal muscle. And we'll be talking about the difference between slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. The harder I work, the more fast twitch fiber I use. And fast twitch fiber is very well adapted to using glycolysis to make ATP. So the harder I work, the more I use the type of muscle that wants to use carbohydrate as an energy source. Okay? Also, we see a lot of hormone changes. So I release more cortisol, but I also release more epinephrine, more norepinephrine, and epinephrine stimulates the enzymes in the glycolytic chain, and so we see a little more carbohydrate being used. And we get more lactate from glycolysis. Right, remember our pyruvate at the bottom, the harder we work, the more anaerobic we're working, the more opportunity there is for the pyruvate to turn into lactate. And the higher the lactate levels, the bigger the impact on using fat, stored fat. Right? Lactate inhibits breaking down the triglyceride and shifting that and using it as an energy source. So we get what we call a crossover. We get a point in time where we can say this is the switch from where I'm using predominantly fats to using predominantly carbohydrate. Right? So here's my percentage of energy, right? And here's my intensity. On this particular graph, they use percentage VO2 max, but this could be percentage of my heart rate max. It could be the speed that I'm running at. Okay. What is my measure of intensity that I'm using here? And you'll see, right, the lower the intensity, the more triglyceride is being utilized to make energy. And the crossover, the point at which carbs start to be more used, is about 35% of VO2 max. So that percentage number goes up when we look at it as a heart rate max number, but 35% VO2 max, and from there on, how much energy I'm getting from carbs gets greater and greater, and the use of fat gets lower and lower and lower. All right? Make sense? Okay, now, what we have to be careful of, if I'm looking at this idea, I don't want to then say to someone, well, in order to lose body fat percentage, you want to work out at a very low intensity. So it's okay to stroll around the arena like this because you're using fat predominantly for your energy source. Well, that's true, right? I would be using fat predominantly, but the amount of energy I need to walk this quick is so low, I don't use very much fat. Right? So we have to get a balance between using fat but working hard enough to actually use a significant amount and make a difference. So we have we can graph that, and depending which textbook you're looking at, some of them call it the FatMax zone. Our book has a nice little box on that, on this concept, which is, let me see if I can find that, page 58. Make sure I'm looking at the right one. Okay. Powers and Howley, which is absolute classic exercise physiology book, also have information on this idea. Okay. So what we're looking at is a graph that looks a bit like that. Okay. And here we have fat metabolism. And here we have intensity, whichever particular measure of intensity you're going to use. And what this indicates to us is that my maximum fat metabolism at the peak of the graph is somewhere around 74% of my max heart rate. If that's the measure of intensity that I'm using, right? That 74 wouldn't be 74 if I was doing VO2 max, it would be 69 or 70 or something. But if I'm using heart rate max. And what it also shows us is that we've got a kind of range here where we can use quite a bit of fat. So if I look at this range, this is where if I can manipulate my workout to stay within that zone, I'm going to use the optimal amount of stored triglyceride. If I go lower than this, I'm using triglycerides, but not at a high enough rate. And if I go above this, I'm using too much carbohydrate. So in here, the bottom end of this range is about 68% of your heart rate max. And if that was in VO2, it would be 55. Okay. And the top end of the range is about 79% of your heart rate max. And if that was VO2, it would be 72. So now we have a useful tool because it's easy to teach someone how to take their heart rate. It's easy to guesstimate a heart rate max. Might be off a little bit. You might have to be a bit flexible once you start seeing how they're feeling. But we can make a rough estimate of what our heart rate max is. And so I can now give them a training range at which they can lose the most amount of fat. Yes, sir.
Sorry, can you explain it one more time?
Sure.
Just slowly.
Sure. So, if I'm sitting down or I'm moving very slowly, okay, I'm working at very low intensity, then it is very clear that fat is the predominant source of energy. Okay. But how much work are you doing while you're sitting still here? Are you working really hard? Are you working hard at all? Okay. So you're using fat, but you're not using very much fat. So you can't say to someone who has a goal to lose 20% body fat, sit down in a chair. That's not going to work. It won't achieve their goal. Okay. On the other hand, if you say to them, okay, go to the gym, get on the bike, and bike as hard as you can for for 10 minutes, they're not using fat at all, they're using carbohydrate. And they won't achieve their goal. So what we want to know is, what's the middle picture? Right? How hard do I want to work so that losing fat mass as a goal becomes a reality? Okay. What's the optimum range of work to make the most of using fat as an energy source? Okay. So what we know is that that's going to be somewhere between 68 to 79% of your heart rate max. Ranges are great because you can't maintain heart rate at a number. It's too variable. So you want a range if they're going to use a heart rate watch, or if they are on a fancy machine that allows them to set a training range on it. What numbers are you going to give them? So you might want to play it a little bit safe and say, okay, I want you to maintain your heart rate between 70 and 76% of your heart rate max. Right? That's going to be within this training range. It doesn't get them too close to either edge. Okay? And if they do it right and they follow your instructions, we should see fat loss. Okay? All right? But there's another factor we have to take into account, because we said that fat was a massive, great, big molecule, and it takes time. The reason we use glycolysis and carbohydrate first is it takes time to start breaking down fat and getting at the energy bonds. So now I've got how hard I want them to work. How long do I tell them to work? Right? If they do this for 10 minutes, are they going to use a lot of fat? No, because we said glycolysis keeps going until about 3 minutes. And in the next 7 minutes, I'm still using carbohydrate and shifting that pyruvate across to the mitochondria. So I'm not going to get to this yet. So what we see is another one, when we look at duration, duration is the other really important factor. Okay. If I maintain the same intensity, so if I get on the treadmill and I jog at 5 miles an hour and I just keep going at 5 miles an hour, at what point do I start to use fat more than carbohydrate?
Past 20 minutes.
Right, past 20 minutes. So I've got to now keep going at this workload. We work out the workload. Now I've got to be able to keep that up for long enough to get to these great big fat molecules. So we have another version of a crossover. For several different reasons. Okay, it takes time to get to breaking down triglyceride. Okay, and especially if you're working with someone who's got a lot of fat to lose, then they want to be careful. We said that if they had a high carb meal, their body is going to prioritize using carbohydrate. So that means that I'm not going to tell them to have jacket potato and baked beans 3/4 of an hour before they come to the gym and run on the treadmill. For most people. Kind of depends on the individual. Right? I know this theoretically, but I also, if I go out at the weekend for a bike ride or a run, I know that if what I want to do is get rid of all of this, I should not eat breakfast before I go, in theory. In reality, I feel like crud if I go out without breakfast, and I'm likely to give up halfway through my bike ride or my run and not finish it. So you've got to weigh that up. Right? Some people's blood sugar drops faster than others. Some people do better on an empty stomach, some people do better on a little bit of food. Right? So don't ever, the rule, you have to be flexible with the rules. Okay? If we go long enough, we're going to deplete our glycogen stores, and we'll talk about carb loading later in the semester. Right, so let's go back here. This is if I'm looking at intensity. Okay. If I change this x-axis, oops, right, and I make this time, then we see a flip here. All right, now I get triglycerides going this way, and carbs coming the other way. I have another crossover. That crossover occurs just after 20 minutes or so, around 20 minutes. That means that to be effective at using fat as an energy source, I've really got to be moving for at least 30 minutes, right? Because I've got to give this chance to get going. Right? If I stop at 15 minutes or I stop at 20 minutes, I didn't start using fat yet, because the crossover starts at 20 minutes. So that means that my minimum training session now is 30 minutes or so, if fat loss is the goal. All of these ideas are really key. You've got to be smart how you use them. What if your client is a woman who is 56, who is 100 pounds overweight and hasn't moved in 10 years? Am I going to give her an intensity rate of 70% of her heart rate max for 45 minutes? Not unless I want a lawsuit. Right? So I might know that this is the goal. Like if she tells me she wants to lose weight, I've got to get her here, but I might have to train her to get her fit enough to be able to start working on losing weight. You would have to explain to some extent that to her, otherwise after 2 weeks she hasn't lost any weight and she's not paying you any money anymore. Right? Because she probably can't walk for 30 minutes, let alone do anything more than walk for 30 minutes. So if you're going to set her a timeline of, okay, try to walk for 12 or 15 minutes, she's not going to use any fat. She's not going to lose weight. She's going to think you don't know what you're doing. Right? So you've got to use the information wisely. Will it work? This will work. Right? The science says this will work. If you set your training watch at that range and you work out for 30 minutes or more, the longer you work, the more fat you use. You will lose fat. You will. Yes.
Is there a difference if it's aerobic or anaerobic?
Has to, well, if I'm going for 20 minutes, am I doing anaerobic or aerobic work?
Oh,
Aerobic work, right? Does that make sense? This will work, but this takes time, And people don't like taking time. They want to lose 10 pounds by next week. Right? Yes.
And the 30 minutes has to be that, like, intense between that range, the percentage of your heart rate.
Really, to do the most good, you want to be in this range for as much as possible. So you might have a 5-minute warm-up where you're getting them up to here, and then a 30-minute bike session or run session where they're in that zone. Does that make sense? This absolutely will work, but you're not going to lose 10 pounds in a week. All right? If we go back to this idea, where we're trying to look at long duration activity for more than 60 minutes, right? Then we start to see depletion of glycogen stores. Long distance athletes will often use the term, I hit the wall, right? My legs just went, and that was it, I couldn't move. That's when your muscle glycogen stores are completely empty, all right? At that point, they have to rely on fat metabolism, but that's too slow for the pace they're trying to keep up. So they either have to quit or they have to slow down considerably. So using a carbohydrate drink can help that situation, but using a carbohydrate drink would negatively impact fat loss, because I would have immediate glucose available in the bloodstream. Right? So again, when do I use a carbohydrate drink? Well, it depends who you're working with and what the event is. If I'm in the gym for 50 minutes, do I need to spend money on expensive carbohydrate drinks? No. Right? There's no research that says you're going to run out of stored glycogen in 50 minutes. You would have to be working out so hard that you wouldn't be able to keep going for 50 minutes. Right? Okay? All right. Next concept then. We've got 3 biggies to cover today, so let's see if we can get them done. We don't have to impinge on our study time on Monday. The lactate threshold. So our friend lactate, if I am working anaerobically, then my pyruvate that I produce at the end of glycolysis can turn into lactic acid, and then very unstable, we see lactate very, very quickly. Right? That lactate can be used as an energy source, or it can be shuttled into the bloodstream, moved away from the muscle tissue. Right? That's typical. And we see an increase in the measure of lactate within the bloodstream. Lactate threshold is one of the best ways of determining someone's aerobic capacity. How fit are they? The problem with lactate threshold is it involves a blood draw, so we don't use it in everyday activities. Right? That means it's not a really useful applied tool, but it is a major concept when you're looking at aerobic capacity, aerobic fitness. You'll see it in the literature, so I really want to go over it, even though it's not something you would do with your PE students or your athletes. Right? It represents, for example, the race pace that you can maintain over time. So, do I have my person run at 7 miles an hour, or do I have them run at 7.5 miles an hour? Okay. which one are they going to be able to keep up for a long period of time? Because it's okay to go at 7.5 miles an hour, you might get ahead of the other person, but if you start running backwards after 10 minutes, then the other person is going to overtake you, right? Even though they were going initially slower. So how fast can I maintain over time is connected to lactate threshold. So which exercise intensity, what measure of work am I doing at the point at which my blood lactate rises above where it is when I'm resting? Okay. The book mentions another term, OBLA. OBLA stands for onset of blood lactate. And just be a little careful. It's one of those situations where we often use those terms interchangeably, but they're really not the same thing. So for an untrained person, this lactate threshold occurs somewhere around 50–55% of VO2 max. Right? My maximum capacity to use oxygen. In a trained person, an aerobically trained person, not an anaerobically trained person, right? So this is not a lifter or a sprinter, this is a runner, a biker, Zumba. Endurance trained individual, that lactate threshold can increase to 65 up to as much as 80%. That means they can work at a higher intensity before they start producing lactate. All right. Blah, 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 blah. What the heck does that mean? Okay. So we need to understand what that means. Okay. Here's a picture of lactate threshold. So, in a person who is not trained, and when you measure blood lactate, it literally has a very sharp corner like this at the point at which it raises. So remember, I only produce lactate if I'm working anaerobically using glycolysis. Right? So that means that to the left-hand side of the corner, I must be working aerobically. And at the corner is the point at which I switch to working anaerobically. Yes? Makes sense? So for an untrained person, that's this. Well, if I translate that into running a race, okay, this means I'm running. I'm producing lots of ATP. I'm able to keep running. Either I start to go faster, or I'm kind of at the limit of how long I can go for, and the work is starting to feel really hard. I'm starting to work harder. I start to work anaerobically. That's kind of the slippery slope down to the end of the race. Because once I'm working anaerobically, I'm getting a buildup of acid, and I can't produce ATP for very much longer. Right? So this is the beginning of the end of forced production for this person. When we train a lot, that happens much later. That means now I can run, and you're starting to slow down, but I'm still running. If I'm lucky, the race ends here before I get there. Right? But even so, I've got a significant amount of time more before I have to start working anaerobically and using carbohydrate. So remember that lactate isn't the culprit when we're looking at acidity. So that switch around the corner doesn't make lactate the problem, but if I'm producing lactate, I'm also producing hydrogen ions, and hydrogen ions are a big problem. Here, I'm not producing hydrogen ions because I'm working aerobically, and my hydrogen ions, remember our little tennis balls yesterday? My hydrogen ions are all getting picked up by oxygen and turned into water. So I don't have a problem to the left-hand side of the corner. It's only once I go around the corner. So as my lactate threshold increases, there's a significant correlation to increased performance for an endurance event. Right? It doesn't have any impact on a power event. Okay. Ish. This comes back later in the semester. All right, so when we come back to it, if we need to review it, be sure to tell me, because when we're training aerobically and we see improved performance, and we say, well, but your VO2 max is at its max, you reached your VO2 max. Well, do I stop training at the point at which my aerobic capacity is at its maximum? Most of us don't, right? We keep training and we keep seeing an improvement, because this is the thing that changes. Okay? I can go for longer, I can go faster before I start to develop a problem with acidity. Right. Monday we have a review session, so we'll look at this over the weekend and we can talk about it again on Monday. All right, I'm going to skip adaptations. In my mind, they're obvious. Right? I don't think you'll have any trouble understanding adaptations. If I'm going to work aerobically, adaptations are positive. What is going to happen within the system to make the system work more effectively? Right? Something's going to change with the enzymes positively. Something is going to change with the substrate I'm taking the energy from in a positive way. Okay? I'm going to be able to use more fat because fat has more energy. So the more I train aerobically, the more fat I'm able to use versus someone who doesn't train aerobically. Right? So one of the things we see with weight loss is the people who maintain weight loss are the people who pick up an exercise program. Because the more you exercise, the easier it is to use fat as an energy source. So it becomes a very positive spiral. Lactate threshold we just talked about. All right? But the third concept is what I want to go through with you. The adaptations I think you can manage. It's typically positive. If I understand the system, the adaptations are things that are going to make the system work better. Okay? So, what about after the exercise? How do I recover from exercising, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic? So, if you think about when you exercise, then depending on how hard you're working, right, you're going to be breathing a little bit harder. You might be sweating a little bit, feel a bit warm. Your heart rate's going a little bit higher than when you're just sitting down here. So, how do I get my body back to its resting state? What is going on physiologically during recovery? one of the things that's going on is that all that phosphocreatine I broke apart early on, I've got to put all that back together. Okay, remember, that's going to take an energy bond. So I have to have ATP in order to put phosphocreatine back together. So, looks a little bit like this. Okay. Here's how much oxygen I'm having to use when I'm sitting down. Okay? Let's say you're going to go for a run. Here's how much oxygen I need to run at 6 miles an hour. Okay? But when I start running, I don't have that oxygen available. So when I start running, I use ATP, phosphocreatine, glycolysis, and somewhere around 3 minutes or so, I'm going to start using a little bit more aerobic metabolism. And depending on how fit you are, think about what happens when you go for a run, right? Don't you find, like, at the beginning of the run, it's like, oh my God, this is... And somewhere around 5 minutes or so, all of a sudden you don't, it's like, oh, okay, I didn't, like, this doesn't feel so bad anymore. Gets easier around 5 minutes. Because at around 5 minutes or so, depending upon the person, we go into what we call steady state. Right? If I keep running at exactly the same speed on a flat surface, my intensity remains the same, the amount of oxygen I need to do that piece of work remains the same. Right? And we can tick over, and everything starts to feel a little bit easier in that tick over phase. Okay? And then we hit a hill. Okay? And now I have to up the intensity, and it feels like hard work again getting up the hill. Okay? So, when we graph that then, we have a hypothetical oxygen deficit here. If, as soon as I started moving, I was able to work aerobically, this is how much oxygen I would need. So this oxygen deficit kind of represents the amount of anaerobic work I had to do in order to reach steady state. This is the oxygen I would have needed, but I didn't have it. So I had to work anaerobically to get to steady state. And so, mathematically, people use the oxygen deficit to represent the amount of work you did through ATP-PC and glycolysis. With me so far? Okay, right? So the front half of the graph makes sense. I chug along at my 6 miles an hour or whatever I'm doing. Right? I'm in my steady state. I've got exactly the right amount of oxygen coming into the system for the amount of ATP I need to do the work of 6 miles an hour. Okay? And then I stop running. Okay? I might walk a little bit for my cool down. Does my heart rate go back to rest straight away? No. Does your breathing rate go back to rest straight away? No. Does your temperature go back down to rest straight away? No. Right? So there's all this stuff going on that needs energy to get back to rest. So this used to be called the oxygen debt. It's a good way of checking whether or not the website you're looking at is up to date. Right? If they use the term oxygen debt, they're out of date. Because oxygen debt suggests that this is obtain back the oxygen I needed earlier on. In which case, this part of the graph would be the same as this part of the graph, but it isn't. Okay? What we know is that actually, after we finish, we use way more oxygen. We have to consume a lot more oxygen than you would think we would need. Okay? This is called epoch. So oxygen debt is out of date. The oxygen that we use at the end of an event is called epoch, excess post-oxygen consumption. Right? So post, after the event, the amount of oxygen I consume is in excess of what I need if I'm not doing anything. Okay. So we have a very rapid phase here. It's about 2 to 3 minutes. And they think that during that first 2 to 3 minutes, what's happening is we're rebuilding phosphocreatine. So if you go back and look at chapter 2, and you look at that very first diagram that we drew on the board, where we said in order to rebuild phosphocreatine, we had to add energy. That's what's going on here. The next bit of the curve could be anything up to several hours. If you look at someone who's worked hard for a long time, so if they've worked out for 1.5 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, if they've run a marathon, heart rate can be still elevated 2 or 3 hours later. Right? Not elevated like 180, but elevated like not at resting heart rate. Okay? So how long this goes on for depends upon what the activity was. How intense the activity was is more important than how long the activity was. Here's another interesting thing. What if your activity was anaerobic? So you get to, let's say we're doing hills outside on the arena, right? You're at the bottom of the hill and you run up the hill and you run back down the hill. How long does that take you? Anybody?
50 seconds.
15 seconds? Right? Maybe? Okay, 15 seconds. I ran up the hill, I ran down the hill, that's 15 seconds. Did I work aerobically?
No.
No. Right? 15 seconds is anaerobic. When you get to the bottom of the hill, are you going? I would be. You guys are fitter than me, right? Are you breathing hard when you get to the bottom of the hill? So why am I breathing hard? Why am I out of breath when the work I just did was anaerobic, and if it's anaerobic, I didn't need oxygen for it? EPOC,
Yes.
right? Because when I work anaerobically, I finish my work here, and I still have an EPOC. Because I still had phosphocreatine to rebuild, right? Because I used phospho 15 seconds, I used all my stored ATP, all my phosphocreatine. If I want to do another hill, I better have all that ATP and phosphocreatine put back. The only way I can recover that system is by using aerobic metabolism to rebuild ATP and phosphocreatine. So I get to the bottom of the hill and go, okay, let's go again. Cool, huh?
Yeah.
Very cool.